Hello, welcome to another episode of David's Divergent Discussions. I am your host, David Gray Hammond, and today I'm here with Rachel, and we're going to have a chat like we always do, and we're going to try and center it around the autistic language hypothesis stuff if the intro video didn't give that away for people who are watching this live. And if you're not watching this live and listening to this on Spotify, it doesn't matter because you can't see the intro video and you're going to be very confused about why I'm talking about it. So we'll start with some brief audio descriptions. I'm David Gray Hammond. I'm a white male presenting person of Mediterranean descent. I am wearing a black vest top. I have a beard, a shaved head, an ear tunnel, and a lip piercing. I have thick rimmed, sort of greyish purple glasses, and I'm sat in a very blue room, as always, next to the famously rickety bookcase. So, yeah. Rachel, would you like to do a brief audio description?
Yeah, so I'm a white person with bright blue hair. You'd struggle to miss it. I'm wearing a black t-shirt with the infinity symbol, rainbow infinity symbol on the left hand side, and behind gay pride flags and the entire LGBT community.
100% agree.
So
Okay, well, we're going to talk about autistic language hypothesis. So I guess really at the root of this, there's probably going to be some stuff about the double empathy problem. And, I think a lot of people probably have heard of it by now, but just in case there are people listening who don't know what the double empathy problem is, Rachel, would you like to do a brief?
Yeah. So essentially, in a nutshell, and I am oversimplifying this, so take it with a pinch of salt. But the basic idea is that people that have different experience of the world. So, for example, like neurotypes. So different neurotypes have very different experiences of the world. Can experience difficulty with empathizing and interacting with one another because of those differing experiences. And the greater the mismatch between two people, the greater there will be, the greater difficulty there will be in kind of empathizing and communicating with the other person. So, for example, when that is applied to neurotypes such as autistic and non-autistic people, we do vastly, so we experience the world vastly different from each other, and therefore our experience and how we relay that to the world and how we use communication is different, and interaction is different as well. I added the communication in bit because that's what I do, but generally in terms of interaction and specifically towards empathy as well.
Yeah, so it really does come down to, I think a lot, it's often brought out when we talk about autistic to neurotypical communication and the fact that, that difficulty to relate to each other's cultural experiences causes that breakdown in communication. And I always like to follow it up with the fact that told we have a issue with communication largely because we're the minority group. Autistic people are not the majority of people, and therefore we are told that we are not right. Which is fundamentally, there's probably a whole other episode in there talking about structural oppression and all sorts. But I first came across obviously your work through, I think we did an Academy Live. We might have done a few actually. I lose track of what I've done live and what I haven't. But you've done work around something that people tend to refer to as the autistic language hypothesis. And do you want to tell us a little bit about that and maybe sort of how you got to there and what it actually is about?
Yeah, I mean, how I got here, there's no straight answer. There's no straight line. It's been a falling backwards through it. I feel is more an appropriate phrase for it. But if we were to put a starting point to it, the starting point would be sat in an English degree, start of second year university, and being in this lecture and being told we one of the projects we were going to do is a small study. Now at the time, the small study was 3,000 words in length.
Okay.
Now done 2 degrees and now doing a PhD on this concept alone. But I thought at the time we get it done in 3,000 words. Naive, right? But anyway, the idea was, I was sat in this classroom, and I remember, so I was diagnosed as a teenager. I was diagnosed quite young for a female presenting at the time person, right? And so I've known for a while that I was autistic. I just didn't know what that really meant in real time. No one ever really sat down and said, this is what it means. But I remember specifically that one of the issues associated with being autistic were having communication difficulties. And I was sat in this class, and I was sitting thinking, no, see, they must have got it wrong. I can't be autistic because I'm really doing quite well at this English degree. English literature and language, right? So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, trying to prove that I wasn't autistic, right? I know that's highly ableist, but I was really young, and it was drilled into me that it was a bad thing. So just give me a break on that one. Done a lot but anyway, about this naive challenge of trying to prove the doctors wrong, which I'm still doing, ironically, just in a very different way. And it turns out I'm still very much autistic, and they got it fundamentally wrong. But anyway, so I come across this wonderful book by a man we all love dearly, Mr. Simon Baron-Cohen. And in this book, I'm reading about, in all the ways, and it was published the year I was born as well. So I was going through this book, and I was reading all these ways in that autistic people are impaired in this thing called theory of mind. I'm like, what's this theory of mind business? So I go look into it, and basically, theory of mind boils down to the ability to understand that I'm a human, you're a human, and therefore we think and feel, and that may be different between people. Okay, in a nutshell, again, oversimplified. But there's like sort of different stages to theory of mind, but autistic people lack theory of mind in general. And then as it kind of developed, it turns out it's only really the last couple of stages of theory of mind, which is that we know you think, but you just don't know other people think, and that is different to you. Okay, so anyway, so I'm reading this book, and I come across a particular test that he used to assert one of his claims that autistic people lack theory of mind. And it was called the spoon test, right? And the spoon test is person A has a spoon. Person B is thinking of a spoon. Who can touch a spoon, right? Now, in my little autistic mind at the time, I went, well, I know the answer to this, thinking very proudly to myself that I was going to give the non-autistic answer. Person B. This is the response an autistic person would give, I read in the preceding line. And I was like, damn it. He's just proven to me right there and then, I am autistic. Okay. But why? Why does that indicate that I lack theory of mind? And he never really explained that part in the book. So I went down a rabbit hole 4 years later and a couple of degrees later to find out. It's because the test actually works. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Brussels to present my master's research, which essentially looked at this test, this spoon test, right? And did a couple of linguistic changes to it. I changed an A spoon to a the spoon, and I put the spoon in the past tense, or I put it in the present tense, and I altered it throughout each line of that scenario and in the question, right? It turns out if you just make tiny little alterations to the test linguistically, so like you just make alterations to the words but don't change the overall meaning of the test, because touching a spoon or the spoon doesn't detract from whether someone's thinking about it or whether they actually physically have it in their hand.
Yeah.
Turns out if do that and you make those linguistic changes, it does alter the test effect, and people don't give person A as the response as a majority. And this is really significant because what this means is essentially if autistic people if this test doesn't it doesn't hold up as a theory of mind test because of basic linguistic changes, what does that mean for later stage theory of mind tests? For example, the Sally and Ann test. So if whoever's familiar with that sort of test in terms of, thinking about who knows what information out of a situation when it's different between different people. Although that question, the Sally and Ann test question doesn't actually explain that. It just asks a very obscure question. So anyway, so I kind of investigated this, but that all kind of came about after sitting in a living room as a uni student, having good old university throwaway conversations as you do with other students, which are mostly irrelevant and mostly just, talking for the sake of talking. But I asked my housemate at the time, his friend who used to come over and they used to have chats and that. And I remember asking at the time because he was the only sort of like non-autistic person we kind of collectively knew. And I said, here, answer these questions for me. And he answered them, and every time he gave the same answer. And I was thinking, suspicious. Because I'd done the same thing that I did at master's level research. Is what I did is I just changed the little subtle linguistic changes from a spoon to the spoon, and person had the spoon versus has the spoon. Okay, so just changing present tense and past tense. Okay, and it didn't change his answer. And I went, that's interesting. Maybe he can't see it. So in autistic fashion, I'll go and underline it and circle all the changes for him so he can see they're very clearly different questions. Still didn't change his response. Interesting. Why doesn't that change your response? Okay. So I kind of went off on a tangent, not even worrying about what the question was even asking in the theoretical sense, right? But actually looking at what the test was doing in terms of why was it having an impact on me? And then each change would correspond to a different answer, but the changes didn't change his response. He always gave person A. And I thought, this isn't a theory of mind thing. This is a linguistic thing, right? So I went to my masters. The people that were doing the masters with me. It was only about 4 of us, and so I went to those people and I went, "Here, come here, have a look at these questions for me." And again, they all gave the same response, even though the questions were slightly different. And then I went to a bunch of autistic people and I said, "Here, come here, answer these questions," and they did, and they all gave different responses, and I was like, "Okay, there's something here." I don't know what, but there is something here. So I go around, I think in total, before I did my master's research, I must have unofficially tested on about 100 people. Going around going, come here. Like, literally, in passing conversations with family members. God, my mum could tell you the amount of times I literally asked her this question, and it just, honestly, she got bored of it, to be honest with you. So anyway, so I went around asking all these questions, and then at the point where I went, there's something here there, I started looking into it a bit more. And that's when I decided, okay, we're going to do this for my master's research. And I actually dropped out of a linguistics degree because I said to them, I want to do this. I want to research this. And they said, okay. We got to it and they said, you just don't understand linguistics. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to go find someone who gets what I'm talking about. And then, for lack of a nice, polite phrase, I stalked Damien Milton for a couple of years at conferences because he seemed to know what we were talking. What I was trying to get is the whole double empathy problem is that we're looking at language differently. We're processing language differently. I at the time I couldn't quite work out how, but I knew that there was something going on, that we were noticing things in language that other people weren't. Or certainly I was, and certainly that was what I was finding in the unofficial studies that I was doing. And that has now been backed up with a test sample of 174 people, which is quite nice because that's definitive and that's statistical evidence that this test doesn't work. So that's really nice for me.
Yeah.
And also just really good evidence that maybe we should be looking into, do these tests actually look at theory of mind, or are they looking at linguistic ability? And if they are, that's not fair to a group of people that potentially process linguistic information differently for meaning, right? So I'm not going to get into all of it because it's a bit of a bit of a roundabout type of way of all the conversations I had with people and asking different perspectives and then kind of going down rabbit holes that I probably shouldn't have gone down, and all these and funny mind experiments that caused some good mental mess for me for a minute. I was up there going, oh, this is actually giving me a headache. So, but to cut a long story short, I essentially noticed that we look and respond to things differently than non-autistic people do, and that generally centers around things like looking at the detail in the words, and specifically when we're known to be literal speakers, and also when we hear things we interpret quite literally. We can override that obviously consciously, but it's still the first thought is literal interpretation, and then that's not probably what they meant. Let's find something else, right? And so I was talking to people about this idea, and I sort of would ask a variation of questions and sort of like, well, how would you respond to this? And how would you respond to this? And if I said this, well, how would you respond to this? And I noticed that through kind of ad hoc thought experiments that were on the fly, that as a literal thinker didn't affect me, started to have profound effects on non-autistic people. Just really interesting because, so if you apply a literal system to a non-literal system, causes some sort of disruption, a bit like non-autistic people see with autistic communication. It causes a bit of disruption for them because it's not the same way that they do it. It's just that, like you said, they're a dominant neurotype, so they've kind of spouted out the narrative for so long, for so many years, that it's disordered just because they're a minority group. And I think that anyone who is autistic and has had a conversation with another autistic person knows that that is just, it's not true that we can't communicate with each other. If anything, we're communicating so much information, you have to talk over each other because there's so much to talk about. And we're mortals on a timeline that we must rush through. And if I could sit here for an infinite amount of time and talk about the cosmos, I could. But I'm hungry and I've got to feed myself, unfortunately, because I'm of human form, and that's how human forms work. Do you know what I mean? So all those sort of weird questions that I was asking people, and people were like, why are you asking all this sort of thing? And it was, I don't know why. It's just, there's something here. Anyway, so I did my master's research. Turns out there was something there. And I kind of, and I've also sort of, I should mention as well, alongside the academic side of things, I also spent a year out, I spent a year out of education working in a residential home for people with complex disabilities, which were autistic and had sort of either physical or other mental health conditions that were in residential care. So I also picked up quite a lot from people in services in terms of the way they would communicate, and specifically like echolalic communication and the rest of it. So this was the hypothesis sort of formed 30% from academia, 80% from experiencing this in the real world with other clients and sort of seeing how they would communicate, and how certain communication would seem odd, but actually, if you thought about it, it actually makes perfect sense. In conjunction with being autistic and then slowly starting to build an autistic network, I would stress here that when I was diagnosed at so young, I didn't actually meet another openly diagnosed autistic person until I was at university. Even though now I'm like, oh, I saw them all the time. They're everywhere. But they weren't diagnosed. And so for a long time, I grew up thinking I was black sheep of the family. Why me? Why did it have to be me? Of course, with all the things, And then I started to meet my community as I got older. As I became an adult, I started to meet my community, and I was like, see, they've gotten this wrong. They've gotten this wrong. This whole social communication disorder, I'm not seeing it. Because I only have ever struggled to communicate with non-autistic people. Autistic people are like the easiest people to communicate with, in my opinion. And this kind of, I'm a curious person, and I will follow a thread wherever it goes. And I was kind of, long story short, which has been, I say, it was not a linear story at all, sorry. But kind of cut a long story short, I pulled a thread and there was something under it. And then I just kept pulling threads and we're here.
I have to say that it's a fantastic story, and it's got it's full on neurodivergent energy. And the only thing I can think is, in typical autistic ADHD fashion, there is a cup of tea that went cold like 4 years ago when this rabbit hole started that you're going to remember any day now.
I'm going to caveat and say that was actually 8 chicken dino nuggets that my housemate's friend had cooked for me because I hadn't eaten in about 8 hours, and I was just literally glued to a computer screen writing this all out because I was like, at the moment I realised this was a thing, I was like, right, everything that I've had little tangent thoughts about, I've got to now put down on paper. I've got to write it all out. And it took me 3 days. And I wrote
I think it
8,000
might be
words.
it might be the world record for ADHD tangents. Having a thought of maybe there's something here, and 4 years later you're studying a PhD in it.
Actually, to be absolutely clear on this, it's not just a PhD; it's a lifetime's worth of work. In my mind, and the thing is, I have to restrict a lot of what I say to the public because it's not substantiated, and these are just thoughts that have a certain level of evidence to them anecdotally. But I can't. And I know because I've seen research that spout things prematurely and have caused untold harm to our community because of that sort of mentality. And so I don't want to come on to a public platform and say, well, I think this and I think this to be true, and I've seen all of this, because I can only speak to what I can report on. I can only speak to what I can research on, because it's not useful to talk about all the things that I think. It's useful to see to talk about the things that I have seen a pattern in, things that I have then investigated, things that I have researched, and things that I have actually then conducted ethical research with. Do you know what I mean? So there are so many things. I mean, there are so many things I want to say. I mean, but again, years of research are going to have to go into that before I can start saying anything. But to put it really nicely and politely, what the public know is a fraction of what I'm currently looking at and where this could go. And I don't mean that in an arrogant sense. I mean that in terms of we could revolutionize communication devices that we use for non-speakers and people that are AAC users, right? We could revolutionize the way we access and give access and gain access to people who have, for whatever reason, and to me the reason isn't important, but for whatever reason they can't use verbal words. We could revolutionize it. And I hear a lot in autistic communication research. We do focus a lot on verbal autistic people, and that's great. We should. It needs to be looked at. But I have seen the consequences, the very real consequences of adults who have been given no communication tools accessible to them, and they have just been left to grow into adulthood and be managed by staff. They don't have a quality of life because their basic needs are not being met. And that's not through lack of staff care. That's because staff are genuinely playing a guessing game as to what those needs are. Because we've got full-grown adults who have rich, diverse inner worlds who just are unable to share that with anyone. And the loneliness, the isolation that comes with that it's unbearable to watch. It's unbearable to work alongside. It's unbearable to see the frustration in people who have, through no fault of their own, and a difficulty with expressing their inner world, but there's an assumption that inner world doesn't exist, and it's fundamentally not true. I've worked with people who have been considered to have learning disabilities. You spend an hour with them and you see the way they interact and you see the way they work out puzzles, and you just like, I don't know who made that assessment, but that is an intelligent young person right there, and I'm not convinced otherwise. They are intelligent and they are capable. It's just there's a communication barrier that's stopping them from being able to express that. And so for me, talking about verbal autistic people in social context and all of that, yes, it's important, and I do love talking about it. But fundamentally, this is just a starting point of a very long journey to get to people in services who currently are relying on a broken system of devices that are based off of non-autistic communication, because that's how communication should be.
And I really wanted to highlight that, actually, because maybe I am demonstrating my own privilege and ignorance here, but I don't really know many people who talk much about the fact that communication devices are not necessarily designed with the people using them in mind. You know, they still have that very normative approach to language and the way it should be used. And subsequently, they're potentially limiting someone's ability to communicate whilst trying to help them communicate. So it's almost like a fundamental, well, it's a flawed system, really, isn't it?
100%. But again, it's still based off of a model. Like, you know, we as a community, I think we've been very vocal and we've pushed things in the right direction for, you know, for a long time. But that's great because we can talk, we can advocate for ourselves. And I'm not going to get into too much detail, but there was a point in my life where I wasn't able to advocate for myself, and choices were made on my behalf that were not in my best interest. But because I had an autism diagnosis, that was overridden. Now, I am very articulate, considering, you know, from where I was. You know, I would say I'm a very articulate adult, and I'm able to communicate and express myself quite well. And there's a reason for that. It's because I've suffered the indignity of having my voice taken from me, even though I was fully verbal. Okay, so even as someone who was fully verbal and screaming at the top of their lungs, still to be ignored, then there is a deafening silence for people who are non-speaking, non-verbal, or use devices. Because again, how easy I've seen it, David. I've seen people take communication devices. I've seen staff take iPads off of people. That is their sole communication device because they didn't listen to me, and they were playing on their iPad. But yeah, that iPad had YouTube and other apps on it that they were enjoying, but it was also their AAC device.
Yeah, it's like taking someone's voice away as a punishment.
Yeah. Or my personal favourite, just absolute lack of forethought, and not even taking iPads, but just letting iPads die.
Yeah.
So no charge for them. Unacceptable.
It is unacceptable.
I've seen it with my own eyes.
And I have some idea as well of the frustration of not being able to communicate, because obviously, as I've mentioned to you and people know publicly about me, I'm schizophrenic, which means that, you know, there are times when I can be catatonic. I'm incapable of saying. There are times during episodes where I can say things, but they're not going to make any sense to any human being other than myself. And I know that frustration when professionals, especially, look at you and assume there's nothing going on inside because you're not expressing it, or they just make assumptions about what must be going on inside. The right help, I would argue that most, if not all, people have very reasonable things to communicate, and we shouldn't make the assumption that they don't need to communicate. It especially upsets me when I hear about people taking away communication devices as like a, because if I walked up to someone and like punched them in the throat so they couldn't talk, that would be, but taking someone's AAC device, like that's just seen as completely reasonable, and I don't see why it's seen as reasonable. We do have a
I
question.
think we do. We know why, David.
Yeah,
Let's don't act like we don't know. We know why, because speaking is the highest form of communication. It is the only form of communication that will be listened to, and even then, on a whim. So let's not pretend to shy away from the issue. We know why people
yeah.
have their communication devices taken off
I'm
them,
going to say this.
not consider their voice, because
I'm going to say this now, though. Speaking is exhausting, and whoever decided it was the pinnacle of communication needs to get in the bin. Because maybe it's from interacting with too many neurotypicals, but I just find, I mean, I could speak very articulately, but, there's the flip side to that, which is even for me as someone who can very successfully speak, it leaves, like, I just don't know. Even I don't know how to explain how exhausting using speech is. Like, so whoever decided that everyone needs to use speech is just a really, and no, quite frankly, horrible person. Like,
But think about it. But if you think about the context of the wider world, though, why do we rely on speech, and why do we not take the time to listen to people with AAC devices? Well, because it's time consuming. And I don't know about you, David, but if you've ever been in a service, those things do not have time. I have never been into a service where staff are like, "Yeah, we got time.
no,
We got
every.
time to
I
listen."
mean, I do advocacy work, so I work with people who are having problems with
Mm.
services, and I have been the person having problems with services. I've never met a professional in any of the services I've been involved with who sits down and goes, "We've got time. Let's talk. Let's work this out." Everyone seems to. There's probably wider arguments to be made here about lack of resources and funding cuts and various things, but
When
it feels like everyone in services that support people like us through to, I mean, not even just people like us, just anyone in professional mental health services, learning disability, any kind of inclusion, they constantly feel like they don't have the time for you.
but they don't. And but we've got to remember again, and I hate to bring history into this because I am a bit of a history nerd too, but I hate to say it, we are fresh off a history that took disabled people and then threw them in institutions and didn't care what happened to them. There was even a time when children were, if they came out the womb looking even slightly disabled, doctors would go on a smoke break and nurses would smother the babies.
Yeah.
Okay, so and that was not even 100 years ago. Okay, deinstitutionalization in this country only started happening around the 50s. Okay,
And it's still, yeah, there are still autistic people
no,
locked up in institutions.
well, but the problem is it's worse now because at least when we please again listen to what I'm actually saying here. We used to have these big institutions where we know bad things happen to people that were disabled, but at least they were in one place. Ever since community care kicked in, and I understand, and it needed to happen. People needed community care, but the way they structured community care was based off the previous model of institutions, but just smaller versions of institutions. I still see institutional practices and services of people giving them their sleepy meds early because can't be asked to deal with it, and it's 8 o'clock, so it's they're giving people that are 30 years old sleepy meds at 9 p.m. Or I've even seen them 7:30 if they're understaffed. Right? They took the idea of community care, but they only applied it to the physical space, right? So they only broke down these institutions in terms of size, but they didn't get rid of the staff, because then all these staff that were employed at these big institutions, they had to go and work somewhere. They had to go and so where did they end up? Back in the smaller services. But now we have so many smaller residential settings that CQC can't manage. CQC are so unfit for purpose now because they were set up under the basis of that there were only a small number of community care homes. But now they've changed and they've diversified so much. CQC is not fit to regulate these things, and that's why we hear about things like Winterbourne View. Because, and again, I'm not even going to get into 80 units because I will go on a rant that will last for hours. But these kind of services are based off of the model of institutional care. It's how do we house people we don't know what to do with, and this is where I will always come back to get rid of the academia, get rid of the fancy language, all of it. What drives me is that people won't have to be in institutions if they could just explain to you what they needed.
Yeah.
But if we don't understand how people communicate, we are never going to reach that goal, no matter what money, no matter what resources, no matter what you throw at it. If you fundamentally are not focused on establishing a communication ground between these people and their service and their carers and the people that are supposed to support them, then you are going to have at best a guess in, stab in the dark at what they're getting at. And then you get these service users who are then punished vigorously for frustration due to lack of being able to communicate. I've seen it where people are human beings, adults are relying on us for a drink of water because the kitchens are locked for their safety. And we have to monitor how much they're drinking, because what if we dehydrate them because somebody on shift forgot to go and give them a glass of water, which very much happens when staff are rushed off their feet. And it's a complex issue. It's not. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, everything would be solved if we could just communicate. It's a complex, very complex, intricate system at play that needs to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. And if we have to do that, we need to do it right. And communication is just a segment of that. There are laws that we need to change. There are funding bodies we need to change. There are funding routes and pathways we need to fundamentally change. We need to have a national health service. We have a national health service in the sense of like emergency care and non-emergency care, but not for long-term residential care. It's privatized in this country, and that's something people don't see very often, is that everyone talks about, oh, the NHS is going to get privatized. We already have a care system that's privatized. It's just that you don't see it. It's the people that need day in, day out, 24-hour care, okay? And I'm not saying that communication would fix all of that. I'm not. But do you know how much guesswork would be cut in half, if not reduced significantly, if people could just say, hey, I'm not saying people would actually listen, obviously. It's a complex issue. But if someone could say, hey, I need a glass of water, or hey, I'm feeling frustrated, or hey, I'm just feeling a bit off right now and I need a bit of support, we wouldn't be restraining people. We wouldn't be medicating people. We wouldn't have people dying in our services through lack of care and lack of understanding. We wouldn't have NHS training based off Oliver McGowan because he was killed because people didn't listen to him, because he was unable to communicate at a moment of distress. I'm getting sorry. I am chill. I'm a chill person, but it frustrates me because we are literally dying because people refuse to listen to us, even when we have a voice. And that is, I can't stress enough, magnified by 1,000 times when you are not verbal. And that extends to communication users, communication device users. But even the way when we look at these communications, picture exchange systems. Oh, I want to shoot whoever came up with that. Hey, let's tokenize your communication. Great idea. Let's put a currency to it. Let's give you something that we can take away.
Yeah, that
you got a voice, but when we choose you to have one, that's not on.
It really
is not on.
Think about the essay in Nick Walker's book Neuroqueer Heresies, Throw Away the Master's Tools, because she says in that essay, that basically the system doesn't give you the tools to dismantle the structures. And to me, the autistic language hypothesis, it might not fix the whole thing, but it's working towards creating a new tool that might help to dismantle some of the structures that are causing the problem.
But I think you've picked up on an excellent point there, David, and that's my point. Is that we see time and time again research generated, and I'm talking specifically about autism research. Time and time again, we see research paper, article, time of all this funding wasted on research that does not benefit us at all. Oh, we have neural pathways in the so-and-so part of the region of the brain that's responsible for so-and-so, and there's a slight difference, but not enough to really statistically say anything, but we're going to say something about it anyway. How does that benefit me? How does that improve my quality of life? How does that improve our community's quality of life? It doesn't. How does telling me I don't communicate like a neurotypical tell me how I am supposed to use the communication system I was born with? It doesn't. How does it tell me, all the research that is come out? I mean, there's been great stuff that's changing the narrative now, and that's fantastic. But we have fundamentally, as a community, I think we have been in dire need of some practical tools. And not just, oh, that's a nice theory, that's a nice idea, something on the ground that works and helps people in a way that reaches people in a different way than just, because I know a lot of research, even still, that helps people is benefited towards white autistic people. We know this. We know that research and funding is primarily gone into white autistic problems. Okay. And that is a fragment of our community. It doesn't include people with multiple conditions, gender minorities, ethnic minorities. We know that we don't actually know how autism presents in ethnic minorities because the research just isn't there. And we know that it's different from white presenting autistic people. Stimming is different. It presents differently because it has to, because race affects your presentation in the world, and it also affects the way the world sees you as well. As many autistic advocates, black autistic advocates have said, race always comes first.
Yeah.
We have a privilege still being white. Okay, yeah, we're autistic, but we're still white at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And we need tools that work for people as a community, and not just, well, it'll work for that group of people. And it'll work for that group. It'll work for the verbal autistics, it'll work for the white autistics, but that doesn't help people who are exponentially marginalized. And I think as a community, we have had enough. So, I mean, I'm speaking for me, but I see it a lot. I think we've had enough of talking. Oh, well, this in theory might work, and in theory might, what actually works, what works for us. We hear about what doesn't work. We know what doesn't work, right? We know, even to the extent that trying to pretend to be neurotypical doesn't work. But what does work?
Yeah.
We know what doesn't. We've gone over page of page of page of page. It doesn't work. Cool. I'm tired of that. What does work? What helps me navigate my life? What helps me navigate job interviews, of all that implied meaning of stuff? How does that navigate me getting my needs met when I need to present to services? I'm very lucky. I have 3 degrees on my wall that says you automatically need to respect me when you come into my home. And I'm also on a 4th now, which means by virtue of the fact that I'm already on, or if not above, the same academic level as the person coming to see me, that cloud that cloaks me in an invisibility, in a powerful cloak that says you have to respect me first because I'm smart. And I'll know if you're trying to do me over. I'm lucky. I have that. Our community as a whole doesn't.
Yeah.
And I've seen people getting written off. Oh, it's just the autism. Severe trauma responses. Oh, that's just the autism. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's just the, I see it. It's just the autism. Don't worry about it. I've seen people in services not get diagnosed. To bring this up, David, I've seen people not being diagnosed schizophrenic until the age of 19 with clearly presenting symptoms because he was diagnosed autistic first.
Yeah.
Just the autism, that the voices. Terrible.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I didn't get diagnosed schizophrenic until this year because I'm autistic.
Oh, another one then. There you go. Do you see what I mean? So it's like, and again, like comorbid mental health difficulties. I'm not talking about labeling autistic women as BPD, by the way. I'm talking about, investigating, is that anxiety, is that eating disorder, or is it actually tied to a neurotype that's just fundamentally stressed and burnt out? They reckon, what was it? Research was done on something like 80% of women in an eating disorder clinic met the criteria for being diagnosed autistic. I'll try and find the research if anyone's interested in that specifically, but I know it was done a couple of years ago. But it's just, we see autism, well, certainly professionals, they see autism. Nothing else can exist outside of that. It must all be the autism. And for a lot of us, that's true. But for a lot of us, it's also, ADHD. It's also comorbid mental health conditions. It's comorbid physical conditions. I've seen so many people, autistic women specifically, that have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that have not been diagnosed because it's just the autism, that bendy stuff. That's autism. Don't worry about that. And it's actually a condition that needs medical treatment. You know what I mean? And again, I'm not saying, like I said, I'm not saying that understanding how autistic people actually communicate is going to change much of this. You know, it's going to change. It's going to take societal, attitudinal shift. It's going to take policy change. It's going to take legal change. It's going to take structural change. Do you know what I mean? Like entire systematic change is it's going to require. But if we're going to, we better go in with the right tools off from the ground up. Do you know what I mean?
Diagnostic overshadowing especially is a real issue. Like, so many of the people I've worked with through my self-employed work, you know, they will have things that are clearly not to do with their autism, and people say, yeah, well, it's because you're autistic. Like, that, show me where in the diagnostic criteria it says your joints dislocate when you move. And I'm glad we got onto
it. But they'll make it.
Yeah, I'm glad we got onto this topic because we had this question from Bep Van Voren. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And
I like this one.
And the question is, what will be left of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria when you apply ALH, so autistic language hypothesis, and maybe sensory sensitivity? I think that's a really interesting question to have a think about, because actually, I think, you know, applying these concepts does kind of change the way you look at the current diagnostic criteria, doesn't it?
So you were saying, oh, it's something to think about. I've thought about this already. Okay. I've become prepared today. No, it's something, you know, fun downtime, thinky thoughts. And I've got people that I know who are trying to change diagnostic criteria to be more inclusive, to be more wider, of more inclusive, catch more people. I'm coming from the perspective, if I had my way, which is not going to happen, but if I had my way, we wouldn't have a diagnostic criteria for autism. And before anyone jumps on me for that, I'm a proudly gay person. There was a time in history for me to identify that way would have meant going to a doctor, being assessed, and being given the diagnosis of homosexuality, and then treated for it, right? Ironically, and for those who don't know, the same man who created ABA therapy, and we're not going to go down a rabbit hole, David, we're not, is the same guy who created gay conversion therapy. So just for those who don't know, it's the same man. So
for anyone really interested, look up the Feminine Boy Project.
Don't.
Well, yeah, trigger warning, massive trigger warning. But if you want to see the evidence, that's the point I was getting at.
The point is, don't. But if you're interested, then fine. But so the I forgot. So the whole idea is that I don't have to now go to a doctor and get assessed and get given a diagnosis of gay. I can just come out to my mum very anxiously and go, please don't kick me out the family. And she looked at me and she went, right, is that it? Dinner's in 5. Bless her. Best way of, at the time I was a bit underwhelmed by it, but now I'm looking back, it's the best reaction you can get to coming out, really, isn't it? It's like, right, anything else? Dinner's in 5. We've known for years. Next. And so I would like to think that, and this is where I think that this is where this communication stuff comes really important. If we understand how autistic people think, how autistic people communicate. So, for example, for a long time, people that were gay were considered to be predators. That was the narrative around homosexuality. It was very damaging. And we now know that not to be true. The same with autistic people. If we know how we think, if we know how we communicate, if we know how that works outside of a deficit model, and we can then just share that information, people can then just identify as autistic. And I find with a lot of people as well, if you know they're autistic and they don't know they're autistic, if you tell them they're autistic, they don't receive it very well. And my whole point is that you don't have to identify with the label of autistic. I'm just saying, if these things under this list that just so happens to be labeled autistic, they seem to work for you, or these things sort of come up for you on a daily basis, here's some things to try to help with that. You don't have to put the big, nasty, scary word autism to it if you don't want to, because you've got a lot of unpacking to do, and that's fine. You don't have to. but I'm still going to offer you solutions to something that you've clearly identified as a problem. Whether that is very specifically related to autistic problems, I'm not going to get into that and upset you with those kind of things, okay? I'm just going to sit here and help if I can. But we can't do that if we don't know what helps. So, to give a really good, clear example of this, I talk about it in my talks. So I'll probably have to change it now, but we're going to give it away for free anyway. Used to work with a young man who used to only his form of communication was echolalia, and he used to say the phrases, "I'm not going out, not having my hair cut, not going to the dentist," all that sort of stuff, right? Same phrase, different activity time. Staff would tell him to go away after 3 repetitions, as per his behavioural plan. Love the behavioural plans. And it would frustrate him deeply. And I was only working with this man for a couple of months, and in that time, I was able to recognize what I thought he was saying, test out the hypothesis. I was right. He was telling us he was bored. He wasn't doing anything. I'm not going to the dentist. I'm not trampolining. I'm not having my hair cut. But to say I'm not doing anything at a very literal level is meaningless. And also say I'm bored, is that even mean? What does that mean? And I'm talking very literally here. What does that mean? It doesn't. He was moving. He was talking. He was breathing. He was doing something. So I'll respond to his echo by saying, no, you're not doing insert activity here. What do you want to do instead? And he'd think for a minute, and he'd say whatever he wanted to do. He'd take your hand, he'd lead you outside to go and do something outside. And he'd spin. More importantly, he'd spin. And for this young man, spinning was his happy thing. It was his happy stim. Spinning was his. He loves to. I get headaches, but he loves to spin. And staff cottoned on. They started using the same way that I was responding to this young man. Suddenly, within the course of 2 months, frustration levels dropped. He stopped getting so frustrated, and also he didn't have to repeat himself so many times to staff. They got 3 repetitions and they got it. And they were like, right, no, you're not. What else are you going to do? And in order to figure that out, again, I would add here some very important context, that his activity plan, very sparse and very boring. So no wonder why this young man was bored all of the time and was saying these phrases all of the time. You filled up his activities. He chose his activities. You gave him the choice to choose his activities. And he was spinning, and he was smiling, and he was occupied. And he wasn't angry, and he wasn't upset, and he wasn't throwing chairs at anyone. And to be honest, I would be throwing chairs at people if you kept ignoring me and telling me to be quiet after coming to you and saying very clearly in my language, I'm bored, give me something to do. I'm bored, give me something to do. And they go, be quiet and go away. Not, obviously, they didn't say that, but redirection and implying through behavior, obviously. And I like to use this example because it's a really clear example of if we can understand where it's coming from and we're not just playing guess in the dark, what are they trying to say? And there's a bit of logic to it and there's a bit of understanding to it, it becomes instantly clear. It actually came to me, funny enough, that whole idea about he might be bored came to me, sat in the car eating chicken nuggets. Genuinely. That's how and I just sat there and went, oh, of course he is, he's telling us he's bored. Yeah. And then I tried it. I wasn't entirely, convinced that was it, but I was like, that was the only thing that was coming to me. That was the only linking between the phrases I could think. Because there was no order to them. There was no particular context to them at the time in isolation. And I was sat there in the car eating chicken nuggets, and I just off shift as well. I was even off shift. I was doing my shopping and chicken nuggets in the car. Why not? And I just sat there, and I literally mid chicken nugget. I was literally mid squirt of ketchup. I was like, "Oh, he's telling us he's bored." Oh, and then I went back the next day, and I started, and it changed everything. And I'm not saying it's going to be that simple. Okay, it's not. And obviously, I have a lot more insight, a lot more understanding about it. I've been playing with it for a lot longer. To put this into context, I've been doing this since 2019. Okay, so a long time I've been working on this. It's only just started to come to the public eye because it's actually got some stuff that's worth saying. That wasn't just sort of isolated events that seemed kind of cool, but didn't really have any linking to them, right? And it just goes to show that if we understood, we could have halved this young man's frustration. We could have understood him sooner. And more importantly, staff wouldn't have been invalidating what he was saying. Because how is he supposed to know that there's a different way to communicate? The same way neurotypicals think, well, that's broken over there. That autistic person doesn't speak the way they should speak. Well, did you ever consider there's different ways to speak? There's different ways to understand meaning. And it's not about sitting here and going, well, if you don't think like I think, then you're the problem. It's about going, okay, well, clearly there's a difference. What's driving that difference? Now we know it's neurological, but how does that, we could go in and look in the brain. We could go and find the specific little nodules of the brain that did all of this. Doesn't help me communicate that I need a haircut. Doesn't help me communicate to the doctor that I'm in severe pain. I just have alexithymia and can't tell them where. On the ground, in every day, in the day in, day out, what tools do we have as a community that aren't so fragmented or behind paywalls that we have access to? And this could be free. This could be used by anyone, anywhere. I just need to get to a point where I can establish it, so I can actually say it's not just me talking on a podcast this evening. I can say this is actually something you can use now and it's substantiated. And that's my biggest frustration is that research takes time.
Yeah.
And I'm aware as a community, what we don't have is time. We are suffering in real time. People are being abused in real time. People are being held against their will for no other crime than being born differently. It's not on. And nobody deserves that.
I really feel that frustration as well, because you might know about me the fact that what got me into the stuff that I do is looking at substance use amongst autistic people. And I mean, I don't have the privilege of being an academic. I have a degree in a completely unrelated topic. Well, kind of related. It's forensic science, but very loosely related. Nothing autism related. And like I've been advocating for autistic substance users for 5 years now, and I'm starting to see but because of the way research works, seeing the start means we've probably got a good 10-20 years until there are really big meaningful changes happening. And
yeah,
I go away and do, like, at the moment, on the side, doing a course that's run by the University of Geneva on drug policy reform, just so I can shore up some of the stuff that I think about and talk about. But the changes to the broader scenario for really anything to do with autism is so slow going. And I think it's slowed down as well because there is so much research, which is just neurotypical people giving bad takes on stuff we already know.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And this is kind of, I mean, I made the decision sort of around the time Academy sort of started coming up. So I met Chloe before Academy started. I met her at the Kent Autistic Pride they ran at the university. And this is how Chloe got me into all of this stuff, right? Sounds like a little cult. But because I spoke to her at this Pride, and because she was a doctor, and I was excited to talk to somebody who was an autistic doctor who would get it. And this was just me talking about conversations I was having in my house with my roommate's best friend, or friend at the time. And she listened and she was like, "Oh my god, this is fascinating stuff." And I was like, "Yeah." And when you like proper info dumping, like proper like happy hands and everything, and she was like, "Yeah, nice, great." And over the time, and then obviously over COVID, because this was before COVID, Chloe then started Academy, and luckily she remembered who I was. She thought it was quite cool, thank God, because I thought it was fascinating at the time. I just didn't think anyone else would care. So after a couple of years, I made the executive decision in, what was it, 2021, I think it was, to say, look, I'm sitting on something that if people had access to now, if it works the way I think it works, this could change people's day in, day out lives. This could change daily lives. This could change how people perceive their interactions, how they perceive themselves, how they interact with other people, how they interact with their children, practitioners, everything, communications and everything. And I thought, I'm gonna pursue this academically. This is why I've got so many degrees. I didn't do it because I'm smart. I had this idea since I was 19, and I've just ran through it through 4 degrees. I just went, I'm just gonna keep going until someone stops me, and I'm at a PhD. No one's stopping me, so I'm gonna just keep running with it. But I made the choice that if I've got enough to explain how this works to people in a way that people could actually apply this in their everyday lives. If it worked, and again, caveat, if it works. If it doesn't work, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. We've got nothing else anyway. So what you got to lose by trying it? And I thought that if I just started talking about it and people wanted to listen, cool. I think it's interesting. I mean, if you don't, fine. But I'm just going to start talking about it. And so I made a page, and then I met my wonderful partner, who is a graphic designer and revolution. I made it look all nice. So bear in mind, so I'd like to stress here, owning up to something. It does all that branding stuff. That was my partner. She's fantastic. Genuinely, shout her out. It's she works at Espresso. So if anyone needs any marketing, if you work in TV production, go over to Espresso. They're fantastic.
And actually, someone has asked, do you have a page?
I do, and it looks fantastic because partner. I will share links, and it's basically just www.cullenconsultancy.co.uk. Simple as that.
And I think you're also on Facebook and
I'm on all of them. Yeah. Again, my partner. I didn't have Instagram before her. I didn't know how it worked, and she's actually given me a dummy guide to Instagram, so that's been fun. But I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted to get it out there. Again, thanks to my lovely partner's graphic skills, because I don't think anyone would have taken me seriously with my little stickman otherwise. And I just started talking about it. And Chloe invited me to come on the Academy to talk about it. And if you ever watched that video back, you'll see that things have drastically changed since, even in those last, 2 years. And so I'm hoping it's going to shape. And this is the thing, it's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. I'm constantly learning new things about it. It's just I'm not willing to share things that I can't substantiate. Things that I can share now, I can substantiate because I've seen them work in real time. I've seen them happen, and that's why I'm talking about them. And the research will follow. It will follow. It's just that's going to take 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But what I can do now is talk about how I think it works enough that people could use this and apply this in their everyday life. I already have people coming to me and saying, oh my God, thank you. This has helped me explain things to a so-and-so, or it's helped me communicate with so-and-so. And I'm like, thank you. Thank you for telling me. I'm glad it worked. Please continue to use it. And so my whole ethos about this whole autistic language hypothesis, I may be proven wrong in 60 years, in which case, fair enough. But I've seen this work. I've seen it work in real life. I've seen it work so many times it haunts me. There are times me and my partner will joke about the fact that it'll be, oh, look at the autistic language hypothesis again. Oh. And it slaps me in the face. It literally, it comes back to bite me because I forget that it's a thing. It then happens and I'm like, see, I know why that happened now. It's because the hypothesis, isn't it? And so I want to reassure people that there is, I hopefully will substantiate this in research. If I don't, I don't. And I'll hold up my hands up to that and go, that's fine. It won't stop me. We'll find whatever else works. But so far, the response I've received from the autistic community tells me that this is a bang on. And so I'm not going to stop. And if I can give people the tools before it takes 20 years to develop in research, then use them now. You might as well.
And as a final question, Bep asks, what do you need to go faster, write a book, develop courses? How can we help? How can the autistic community help advance the cause of this hypothesis?
Well, currently, right now, I'm doing some research and I need some participants. So if anyone's local to Kent or knows anyone local to Kent in the UK, Canterbury campus, need you down there because I'm going to be doing some research real soon. So I need some participants to start establishing this. So if anyone knows anyone or can give a shout out to anyone who knows that may be interested, please let me know. Or please, there's a poster going around with a QR code on it. You can just scan that, send me an email straight away. Longer term, I would love to write a book. You would not want to see my ramblings be ends long. But I'm also cautious. Again, as an academic, I've seen the real damage that people making bold claims has had. And I don't want to go out there contributing to that because I got ahead of myself and got excited. And I am very excited about all of this. But I am also very aware that there are certain parts to this hypothesis that could cause harm. And I don't mean to put anyone off, but in terms of it could cause harm if I'm wrong. And then certain assumptions are made and certain conclusions are gotten to that could be very damaging. And so if I'm wrong about this, I'd rather prove that in research and say, hey, I was wrong, than go ahead and start writing books and articles about how I think things work. Because if I think about things, that's cool, but that's my lens of privilege, experience, and all the rest of it that goes into that. That doesn't translate to real life experiences of other people. And so that's why research needs to be done. I could sit here and spout about my opinions for hours about what I think to be true, but I need to be able to back it up in research for that to have a real impact for people. So I want to talk more. I want to say more, but I have to. So as much as I want to say everything. The best I can do is apply it with my private clients because that's safe. in the realms of they'll come back to me, they'll feed back to me. It's a very real time, ongoing conversation. So I can't write books and make general statements. Does that make sense? This thing is so individualized and so broad at the same time. It's hard to quantify it without using very real examples that can't happen until they're generated. If that makes sense. And we can use it to predict things, but again, that's where we fall into the tricky category of if I start explaining too much about how we could use it to predict things, then we could fall down rabbit holes that could cause harm, and I don't want to do that. So the best I can do for now is say it's coming. Please be patient. Research takes time, and I'm going to talk about what I can talk about here and give tools that I can give in workshops and webinars and all those conferences that I've been doing. Thank God people want to hear about it because people have been booking me left, right, and center. It's been a busy year. It's going to continue to be a busy year, which is great because it means people are interested, which makes me just very happy because it's so fun, isn't it? It's just so fun to talk about. And the ramifications and all the rest of it. So if you could spread the word, get me into your schools, get me into your conferences, get me into your education centers, get me where you can. If you know someone who's looking for a space for a speaker that is specifically in services, training, that sort of stuff, get me where we need this stuff, which is people that are non-verbal in services, psychiatrists, social workers, people that have on real time on the ground have interactions with our community. These are the people that need this, and our community as well. Hence why I do these sort of things. Our community needs this, and I'm not going to stand in the way of giving people tools that they need. Simply put as that,
Well, it's been a really, really good episode, and I feel like I have a lot of excitement now to go away and find out even more about the autistic language hypothesis, because I sort of had a loose idea of what it was. So I've not had a chance to really have a proper in-depth discussion with you about it. So this has been a really good episode. I've really enjoyed it anyway, and based on the comments everyone else has as well. So I think it's been fantastic, and we've really enjoyed having you here to talk about it. And I really hope that as the research progresses, we can hear some more and more stuff.
Oh, the moment I've got this stuff in a thesis and it's passed, go straight out to all of you. Go straight out.
Brilliant.
Once we've got it. But remember, again, it's going to be an increment of what I've been talking about over years because it's a PhD. And as I found out doing a PhD, it's actually not a big. Okay, people are going to shoot me for saying this, but I went to a PhD and I was all of this massive stuff, and they were like, "No, you can do that. That's what you can do. That's what you can do for a PhD." And I was like, "Oh, I was going to be James. I was going to do all the things." And they were like, "Yeah, but you've got 3 years. Be realistic." And I was like, "Oh." So coming back to the whole, what I did at undergrad. I'll fit a lifetime's worth of work into 3,000 words. Don't worry about
it. I think that's probably one of the biggest things about being neurodivergent, isn't it? Though we want to do all the things all at once, and sometimes the hardest part is to slow ourselves down.
Yeah. Speaking of which, if we don't end this, we're going to carry on for another couple of hours.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you very much to everyone who's tuned in live. If you're listening, Spotify or podcast platforms or YouTube afterwards, also thank you for tuning in. This has been David's Divergent Discussions. We've been talking about the autistic language hypothesis, and it's been a fantastic episode. Thank you so much, Rachel. Now's the bit where we wave awkwardly.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.